thank you to everyone for joining us in our third installment of the Pennsylvania Care Partnership Cultural and Linguistic Competency webinar series. We're so enthused to have all of you joining us today. It's definitely going to be a record-breaking amount of participation. And we hope that your attendance today finds you well, your families well, and your communities well, given the difficult times that we're facing with COVID-19. Today's presentation is entitled Intersectionality Matters, Mitigating Unconscious Bias and Unintended Racism in Behavioral Healthcare. It features our amazing keynote speaker, Sharon G.E. Washington, who is renowned for engaging diverse audiences on the complex intersections of race, historical trauma, social inequality and justice, and the impact of these factors on health outcomes. She's an award-winning educator, and as an award-winning educator, Sharon creates and instructs trainings reflecting the deliberate use of educational settings as safe spaces for healing from the social and cultural trauma of racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression that limit the capacity of the human spirit so that learners may use that power to heal the world. We're so privileged and honored to be able to have Sharon joining us today as our keynote speaker. This ominous voice that you hear from me is myself as the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership. My name is Kelsey Leonard. I've been serving with the PA Care Partnership for over 5 years now, and our webinar series is a series that we've been building annually over the past few years. And this particular session is a culmination of a lot of hard work, both on the part of our keynote speaker, but on the part of our PA Care Partnership team and staff and community, like you folks, showing up and wanting to engage in enhancing your CLC programming and your cultural and linguistic competency knowledge. So we're, again, so honored by all of your attendance today. We also want you to be aware that we offer technical assistance through my services as a CLC coordinator. If your county or local system of care or youth or family support group are thinking about how to develop policies around cultural and linguistic competency, thinking about how to conduct trainings for your staff, we're here to partner with you and to help you. And so I provide my email on this slide. It's leonardkt@upmc.edu. I'll be sure to also put that in the chat box once the webinar gets started so that you have that information if you are signing on through the Zoom platform. With that noted, today's session is actually all of our sessions. It's a three-part series for this year, but then all of the previous years I mentioned are all housed on our PA Care Partnership website. So again, I will put that in the chat box for folks very shortly so you can access that. But today's webinar, the recording, the PowerPoint slides, which I'll load into the chat box, will also be posted online at this web address for you to download and rewatch at your leisure or share with your extended network for folks that maybe weren't able to be on today's session. I also want to highlight something really cool that we're doing for the first time today, and that is we have Emma from Ink Factory. You might be able to scroll up and see her video, but Emma from Ink Factory is a visual note taker, and she's going to be capturing the conversation live. And throughout the session today, you'll have a few moments where you'll get to see what she's capturing, but she's going to be capturing the conversation live, and at the end, we'll have this wonderful visual representation of today's conversation. So Emma, can you give us a sneak peek of what that's going to look like? I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelsey. I just need a moment to share my screen and then we're good to go. So this is the starting title. I don't know if it's showing up for you guys.
Not just yet. We'll give it a moment to say it's load, hopefully.
There we go.
While that's loading, I've just put in our webinar series website into the chat box for everyone.
All right. Yes, so it doesn't look like much now, but as you guys are having this conversation, I'll be pulling out key points and drawing and synthesizing the information, and the artwork will come to life as we go. So we'll check in later for more results.
Thanks so much, Emma. And for folks, you'll get to see the final product at the end, and then we're also going to make it available on our website. So we'll post that, you'll be able to download it. We're going to have some really creative products and outputs from that visual representation. So I believe now that I'm seeing Sharon's screen, which is a really awesome smooth transition. And so I will turn it over to Sharon to get started with today's webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. I am so excited and honored and grateful to be able to join you in this series of dialogues that you have been holding. And I'm really excited to be able to advance the dialogue and talk about mitigating unconscious bias and unintended racism, with particular focus on intersectionality and how that applies to the populations that you serve and to your own experience being on the front lines of delivering care to vulnerable groups. As we get started, I just want to acknowledge and honor the pain and fear and anger, exhaustion and resistance that's happening in our communities, particularly around police brutality in the Black community. And I'd like to just acknowledge that for me personally, as a Black woman, that is very heavy on my heart, my mind, and my spirit. And I imagine that to be the case for many of you. So I'd just like to speak the names of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and acknowledge the many, many others that are ancestors and that hopefully provide us some inspiration, motivation, and energize our commitment to equity work, to dismantling systems of oppression, and to leveraging our positionality within institutions to make a difference, to try to change the shape and the culture of our communities. So then with that as a framework, I'll introduce the aims of our session. So today I'd like to hold a discussion. There's a variety of opportunities throughout this webinar where I'll ask for your input. We'll do some polls, we'll check in and have conversation, and hopefully you'll be able to use the handout as a great tool for capturing your thoughts and reflections along the way. So today we will define unconscious bias, stereotypes, and unintentional racism. We will explore the impact of intersectionality on marginalized groups, really located within the populations that you serve, really building from the survey that many of you filled out prior to this session, so thank you for that. We'll discuss the experiences of microaggressions among the PA Care Partnership community and identify some action steps that could increase allyship and accomplishing. So just to ensure that we're on the same page before we get deeper into the content, you should be able to access in the chat a link to the PowerPoint slides as well as the handout, which are both in PDF form. The handout, I think, is going to be helpful in keeping your thoughts and reflections sort of live and drawing your thoughts and ideas from your mind onto paper, and then we'll converse about it throughout. When we have slides that ask for some discussion, if you would like to contribute, if you find that you have something you'd like to share, please raise your hand, and Kelsey's going to help us to manage the chat as well as chiming people in so that we can have some lively discussion. I would encourage you to full screen your Zoom so that there's a number of charts, especially reflecting the feedback that you all offered in the survey that was sent out for the last couple of months. So if you'd like to see that data more clearly, it'll be helpful for your screen to be in full screen mode. And then lastly, if there's any terminology, there's a variety of terms that I'll be introducing and talking about. But if there's anything that's said that, that you don't understand or would like some clarification, you can just highlight that in the chat and Kelsey will chime in and let us know, and we can slow down and make sure we stay on the same page. So anytime that I am opening up dialogue around diversity, inclusion, equity, anti-bias, and oppression, all of that, in my experience, is most successfully navigated if people enter with vulnerability. And the ways in which we are socialized into ideas, our identities, the ways that we navigate society, and the various hierarchical forms of value and oppression and dominance and privileges around what makes us who we are is deeply embedded in our sense of self. And in order to truly unpack that and to truly share and receive others' experiences, I find it most effective to practice the difficulty of being vulnerable and to hold a space that allows people to feel safe and brave enough to do that. I like to set some agreements. And so I'd like to invite all of you to commit to engaging in this conversation and holding space for this discussion with love, compassion, and respect. First, for yourself, for being someone who is willing and consistently engaging in difficult work with vulnerable groups, trying to make the world a better place, and allowing yourself to do some self-reflection and growth in that process. Also holding love, compassion, and respect for each other as we talk about things, as I ask for your input, as I try to hold a virtual space for some conversation. People are in various levels of development around diversity, equity, and anti-oppression discourse. And so allowing people to contribute and to participate and allowing people to feel like they are being well received in that growth process. Also holding that compassion, that love and respect for the communities that are most impacted by inequities and disparities, and then extending that to the communities that are the benefactors of these systems of oppression. And sometimes I lose people when I ask them to extend it to that last level, but I think that it's important that the people who are most invested in the status quo to be met with humanity. And it's most likely to be through a human connection that people will become awakened and aware and choose to divest from the systems that are perpetuating inequities. I'd encourage us all, despite the fact that this is being recorded, that so to some extent, confidentiality isn't as applicable in this setting, but I would like for people to respect if you're talking about the experiences of people that you serve, that we're honoring confidentiality to the best of our ability. Although we all belong to a variety of different identity groups, if we can speak for ourselves by using I statements, be open-minded to other people's experiences and where others are in their development and allyship, in awareness around how bias and microaggressions manifest. And although we might disagree on different things, and that's welcome, that we seek understanding amongst each other. One thing that I think is important, since you all function as a coalition, you collaborate, you might interface with each other in various ways, is that as people are sharing and chiming in and making this a lively discussion, that you don't stamp people's comments in time, so that when you're having conversation in 6 months, if they said something in this discussion, in this webinar that, took you off base or that you didn't agree with, that you acknowledge that people will grow, and that when you have conversations and collaboration in the future, that you're not holding people to their perspectives in this very moment. We can appreciate each other's backgrounds, hold a no judgment zone, so that we don't have to make conclusions, but again, that we're just trying to learn from each other. And while we trust in each other's positive intentions with where we're coming from with our contributions in the conversation, we can also lovingly hold people accountable for the impact if people are using outdated terms, or if the positionality that they're holding in the conversation is causing harm in some kind of way. And these are difficult conversations, and this is a difficult time that we are that we're functioning in, between the pandemic and how that's affecting us in all ways. And so your emotions are relevant and they are welcome here. And I believe that there's something to be learned from those as well. So I just would like to name that. So to get started, I would like to thank the members of the partnership who participated in the survey that was sent prior to this session. And to get started, there were about 43 respondents to that survey. And so I want to just acknowledge that this isn't a full representation of everyone who does the work that the partnership is engaged in, and that there are certain groups and identities that are more reflected perhaps in the survey than are on this call, and that are on the front lines of doing the work that you all are doing on behalf of vulnerable groups. But I would like to introduce you to the characteristics of the folks who participated in the survey. So you'll see that 79.1% of those who participated are white, 72.1% are female. Most people identified as either cisgender or didn't respond to the gender identity, which to me perhaps indicated people not necessarily being clear about what cisgender means, meaning that your sex assigned at birth is in alignment with the gender identity that you subscribe to for yourself. We have Black African American or of African descent represented at 11.6% in the survey, Latinx 9.3%, LGBTQ 9.3%, religious or spiritual minorities also at 9.3%. And so then we have sort of a tapering off of a variety of other identity groups. And so I just wanted to give you a snapshot of when I bring back the feedback from the survey, that these are the identities and experiences that are being reflected in that. Again, it's not globalizing, but just giving us a bit of insight into some of the perspectives. Other characteristics that are represented in the survey results show that the kinds of organizations, agency, or county that folks are serving, largely represented on the county level, healthcare related providers, 25.6%, other kinds of mental health, managed care, rape crisis, sexual assault, and other social services at 23.3%, community-based organizations at 18.6%. And so just you can see that there's quite a wide array of representation of the types of agencies that spoke up and offered their experiences and insight through the survey results that I'll be sharing. The roles that people served, largest representation being frontline staff, almost 35% of the people who participated really working directly with families and youth, followed by mid-level administrators at 25.6%, providers, healthcare and other, both at 18.6%, system partners at 16.3%, family partners 11.6%, and so you can see how it tapers off into other levels of engagement with youth and families. So that's a bit of the characteristics of the people who contributed to the survey. And I'm going to sort of use the survey results throughout the talk to illuminate from people who participated what people's experiences are, and that will contribute to the dialogues that we'll have. But I'd like to get started with unpacking unconscious bias. And so to do that, if you look at your handout, if you're going to use that as the tool, the first question asks you, and I'd like for you to think about, when you think of the word bias or when you hear the word bias, how does it make you feel? Does it feel like a negative? Does it feel oriented or associated with something positive? But I'd like for you to share in the chat or note for yourself, but share please, and we'll just have a little check-in on when you hear the word bias, how do you feel about it? What comes through your body? What comes to mind? And Kelsey can maybe share for the larger group what comes up in the chat based on your contributions. So what does the word bias trigger in you? And what do you feel about it? We'll just take a minute or two to let people type up, even if it's just a word or two. Doesn't have to.
Some responses coming in. We've got things
Great.
like, makes me feel uncomfortable. It's a negative part of being human. Some negative, positive response feelings, defensive, cautious, barrier. That it's something that everyone has. That you can be leaning one way or another. Bias sounds like a bad thing. It can feel shameful. Negativity, judged, depending on the context, but usually negative. Again, feelings of defensiveness, feelings of it being, this is interesting, actually feelings of it being neutral because it's always there. And that personal experiences change our perception of bias. Even though I realize bias can be positive, I generally think that it indicates someone has a negative opinion of something. Some other key words that are coming out: prejudice, inherited or taught, negative feelings. Normally heard as a negative, but can be used as a positive as well, or based on preferences. Greater connection with something, so that maybe you have a bias because of a greater connection to something.
Yeah. Do a couple more?
Yeah, a couple more. We have something around, again, ignorance, prejudice, judgment coming out towards the end. Some more additional comments around negativity and vigilance, or being vigilant. That might be a good one to end on.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So I think that it's really important that when we're talking about bias, that we're just aware of what our biases are towards the concept of bias, towards bias in and of itself. And sometimes when we enter into the conversation, we're already feeling edgy, defensive, oriented towards the negative, etc. So thank you for that check-in, and thank you for just sort of allowing yourself to name what comes to mind, what comes through your feelings, and what comes through your body when confronting bias, when naming bias. So for the sake of this conversation, we'll operate with the definition of bias as a decision that we make so quickly that it simply occurs to us as data. And we don't know that we've actually taken in data points, interpreted them, and made meaning out of them. And so it's driven by the oldest part of our brain, the most ancient part of the human brain that operates out of rapid associations. And it's connected to natural sort of fight, flight, freeze responses that have to do with our safety. And so in our evolution as human beings, being able to make rapid assumptions or associations with what's safe or what's dangerous is what's driving this way in which, as we are socialized and exposed to various things, as we're taught formally and informally, ideas and concepts, that associations are made in that old part of our brain, that as we function in cognitive ways throughout our day, we utilize those associations, and it contributes to our decision making, our mannerisms, our body language, how we connect with the outside world, and how we make decisions beyond our cognitive level. And so some research out of neuroscience, and this was a study that was done in 2002, so really before like YouTube and Snapchat and Instagram and all of this information was constantly readily available to us. They found that at any given time, 11 million pieces of information are available for our brains to process, but that's too much. And so our brain filters that information and all of those data points through a variety of levels of first, our perception. So there's all kinds of information that is accessible to us, but our limited senses are unable to perceive. So different kinds of light and smells and scents and other things that are just sort of beyond our human capacity of perception. And then there's interpretation and our ability to interpret that data and make sense of it or not. It's then filtered through our preferences, and ultimately it's filtered significantly to the point that our selective attention allows for our brains to process only about 40 to 50 pieces of information at a time to be absorbed on a cognitive level. So I think an important aspect of appreciating what bias is, particularly unconscious bias, is that through the nature of the human brain, and our evolutionary practice, and just how the brain works to manage and mitigate millions of data points that are accessible to us at any given time, it creates blind spots. And it's through these blind spots that all kinds of realities and lived experiences and possibilities and probabilities are just filtered out of our ability to access and process and decipher that. That is a human function. All human beings have blind spots. All human beings have biases. And I think part of our conversation throughout the rest of this session is to talk more about the ways in which particular bodies of biases and particular derogatory and damaging ideas are taught to us and socialized to us in our society. So here's a study that was done with radiologists, in which radiologists were asked to look at this scan of human lungs and look for cancer nodes. And I myself am no radiologist, and I've actually never presented this to a group of radiologists, but every other group that I've presented to has been able to see something in this scan of human lungs that does not belong there. Maybe raise your hand if you see something in these human lungs that don't belong.
And we have a few answers coming into the chat box that I'll share. But for folks that, we've got a few folks that are raising their hands too. And if you aren't sure how to use that function, you just click on the participants logo down at the bottom and find your name. And next to that, there'll be options for you to raise your hand. I have a few folks. Okay, maybe do you want me to call on someone, Sharon? Or do you want me to go through the chat box once we see we've got a few hands going?
Yeah, if there's somebody in the chat box that's named it, we can
go with that. Okay, well, I think Mary Jo actually might have even been up before a few hands. So Mary Jo Battle in the chat box wrote that she saw something that looks like a gorilla.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is this gorilla doing in these human lungs? Well, interestingly, in this study, 83% of the radiologists who were asked to search for cancer nodes didn't notice that there was a massive gorilla in these human lungs. And so does that mean that they're not good at their jobs? Does that mean that they shouldn't be paid so well? Probably not. But what it does signify is that through selective attention, whether it's in casual situations or with people who are specialized within their fields, it is very possible and oftentimes probable to miss something that's very visible that's going on around you when you're focused on something else. And so not only do we have unconscious biases through just the mechanisms of the brain that are aiming to filter a lot of information, as well as the rapid associations that are associated with our flight, fight, freeze responses in our body and our neurological responses. But when we are focused on a particular task or when we are looking for something specific, it's very easy to miss and omit very visible other aspects of the environment. And so when you're doing work and you are engaged in trying to change policies, you're trying to help young people, move through these systems, or you're having this particular conversation, it can be very possible and even probable to miss kinds of biases and kinds of microaggressions that may be very visible to other people, but it's outside of the purview of your scope, of your ability to perceive or interpret those things. Or just outside of the selective attention of that particular moment. So again, just emphasizing that unconscious biases are really a reflection of blind spots that we have, not innate hatred that we consciously carry about groups of people that we despise, but really more so for most people, it's a reflection of these various functions of the human brain, as well as our socialization that promotes blind spots, especially in the domains of identities that our oppression is grounded in the function of race or historical use of religion to create values around identities and groups. And so in the ways that we're socialized not to talk about race, not to talk about religion or money or sex and sexuality or even politics in a work setting or with family or over holiday dinners, we are the conversations that have created inequities, the practices and historical contexts that have produced inequities and placed harms on certain groups based on their identities. we're collectively taught not to talk about it. And we're largely not exposed to those historical contexts in our formal education. I studied African American studies in college, and it wasn't until I got to college, I had the privilege of getting to college and getting a scholarship to access the academy, that I began to learn about people like me. And so in addition to the sort of natural socialization to just not know about everybody's experiences, we're also taught to avoid learning about the very contexts that produce inequities. And so this unconscious bias that's a function of all human brains, combined with our socialization, our segregation, where we're oftentimes not exposed to people of a variety of diverse backgrounds, and the racial and other identity-based stereotypes that we are socialized into, helps to promote a cycle of unintended racism and unintended bias. So to then transition into the role of stereotypes in perpetuating bias and microaggressions, I'd like to show a couple-minute video. And so you might want to just check your audio to make sure it's not super loud, as I find that that's sometimes the case when these videos get turned on.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
So, in case anyone hasn't seen or isn't aware of the Clark doll study, it was initially implemented in the 1950s, and the researchers were able to demonstrate that Black children, as early as 3 years old, are exposed to the stereotypes and the derogatory messaging of Black people and Black identity in a way that was affecting them psychologically, and that segregated schooling contributed to the development of internalized stereotypes and harms that were impacting children, and it really contributed to the desegregation of schools in the mid-50s. And this replication of this study was done actually very recently, and unfortunately, the perpetuation of those stereotypes hasn't changed. Stereotypes being defined as widely held but fixed and oversimplified images or ideas of a particular type of person or thing. And so, as you can imagine, it's not as though the parents or the teachers of these children are telling them formally to believe these things about Black and white and how that then relates to themselves. But when you read children's books, and until like the last 5 years, there really haven't been a diverse array of books that children can be exposed to that represent the wholeness of all identities. Or informal schooling, not only what is taught, but what is omitted. And so when you don't see people who look like you contributing to what makes our society rich and valuable, and when you see media that hyper depicts criminality of Black and brown people, of poor people, of people in inner cities, the characters that are bad or evil, oftentimes being darker complexions, and other kinds of parallels, those themes produce and perpetuate stereotypes that then people not only are internalizing for themselves as they subscribe to those identities, but unconsciously are associating with certain feelings when they see those identities. throughout their community and in the world. And so when we think about the relationship between unconscious bias, the utilization and socialization of stereotypes to perpetuate racism, I think it's important to ground ourselves in an understanding of what racism is. And oftentimes when people say racism or racism is brought up, people are thinking about or referring to, towards the top of this pyramid, interpersonal racism. So like derogatory remarks or vandalism of Black and brown communities or individuals. But really, I want to ground us in this broader part of the pyramid and broader aspect of the definition of racism, and that has to do with structural racism. And so the ways in which systems of policies and institutional practices, media representations, and other kinds of societal norms and expectations reinforce and perpetuate racial group inequities. And so it's a system of functioning. It's a system that even if and hopefully when every single individual has been taught anti-racism and undoing the racism that we've been socialized into, when no one individually does anything that's racist in their day-to-day living, we are still operating institutions that have racist practices, norms, and implications that also have to be undone. And so honoring that, having access not only as an individual to the kind of privilege that might be afforded to you based on your race, particularly in a white supremacist society, having a white race or very light-skinned complexion, but also having access to that institutional power that your race doesn't have to function as a barrier to accessing the systems and institution that govern our society, which you all in your work as members of this coalition are deeply connected to the various institutions that, of course, the young people that you serve are having to navigate as they grow and develop. So then we have institutionalized racism. So the ways in which institutions perpetuate bias and racial group inequities through differences in how policing, if we have a police force, but like where and which neighborhoods do we send police to and based on what? And, keeping in mind historical context and how can institutions work to be more inclusive of the communities that are being served by those institutions. And when they aren't practicing high-level inclusion, how is oppression perpetuated through the institutional practices? Thinking about it through a gender identity and sexual orientation lens, if you have intake forms and the box for gender only has two options, male or female, then you're sending messages to people who don't identify as either male or female that they're not welcome, they're not seen, they may not be treated for who they are, because in the intake, in the institutionalization of how you acknowledge people at the front door and at the front desk doesn't speak to their existence. So that's, I think, a useful way to think about policies and practices that perpetuate group inequities. And then, of course, we have the interpersonal level, which we're probably most familiar with. And then I also want to highlight the internalized racism. So when people devalue their own identity and culture according to the societal norms that you see through the media and other stereotypes that suggest that you are less able to do things. Girls are not as good at science or math, or, Black and brown kids don't do well at standardized tests. Like, part of that's true because of the structural bias in the test design itself. And part of it, empirically, we've been able to see that when you tell young people that, or when you tell people that they're probably not going to be very good at something, they actually perform more poorly than people who didn't receive that primer. So I just think it's important as we continue through and as we talk about intersectionality that we're not only thinking about the interpersonal dynamics between two individuals or between a small group, but institutional practices and how that lands within a societal system of oppression. So then to transition into intersectionality as a lens through which we can explore and appreciate how Identities and development of especially multiple intersecting marginalized identities in our society are influencing the youth that you serve and their communities, and even yourself as an ally and advocate for these marginalized groups. Intersectionality was coined, is mostly credited to Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, but the concept of having multiple intersecting identities that are devalued in a racist, sexist, homophobic, patriarchal, capitalist society has been talked about, you know, for a very long time. And it highlights the intersecting effects of race, class, gender, and other marginalizing characteristics that contribute to our social identities and affect health. And it has to do with the ways that various forms of oppression are sustained in a really complex matrix of power, that structural component of how oppression is perpetuated, that's really rooted in and actively maintained by societal structures and institutional systems. And we can think about how the intersections of having a variety of stereotyped and marginalized and disenfranchised identity in one particular person or clustered within small communities has implications on the individual level, on interpersonal levels, community levels, and a societal level. So on the individual level, I'd encourage you to be thinking about and reflecting on how the youth that you serve, but even also beginning with some self-reflection, how as an individual, one's personal, internalized, or intrapersonal significance and power that a person assigns to their identity. So maybe for myself, I identify very strongly and saliently and primarily as a Black person. I also identify as a woman, as cisgender, as queer, but in different times, I'm not thinking so much about being a woman. I may be thinking about being a mother, and a woman is implied in that, but how I assign power and how I ground myself in the various layers of my identity is something that there's so much variance. I mean, every single individual is going to have some variance in sort of how salient the variety of identities that they carry means to them, and that can change throughout time and throughout situations and contexts. The interpersonal level has to do with exchanges involving experiences in this context of discrimination or of privilege, and how you might be able to maneuver the different kinds of identities that you carry in order to maximize your opportunity. Interpersonal levels really speak to as it pertains to the health outcomes that are associated with intersecting identities. The discriminatory, aversive, stressful interpersonal exchanges that potentially increase in frequency as the number of marginalized identities increases. So if a person is a tall white male who is gay, there might be times in which that vulnerable or marginalized identity of being gay, that might be the most salient identity that that person moves through the world with. And however, if that person was gay and also physically disabled in a way that was visible, and Black, and dark-skinned, that the way in which the number of marginalized identities is increasing with this different person, that the likelihood of experiencing microaggressions and harms and discrimination increases, and not necessarily in a mathematically additional way, but in a multiplicative way, in a compounding way that produces increasingly more negative health outcomes and societal outcomes for individuals. And then on a community level, the outgroup status could increase the risk of victimization in terms of crime, threats to civil liberties, other identity-based trauma exposures. I know that looking at my news feed in the last week, but really as we cycle through periods of violence, particularly against Black lives, in my experience, I feel a trauma. I feel in my body and in my mind a sadness and a depression that doesn't belong to me and my individual identity, but I can't so I can't take that out of how I'm embodying that as a member of a community that's experiencing trauma. And I'm sure in various ways you all can relate to that, whether as individuals, but even the secondary trauma that you experience through being in close proximity to very vulnerable communities and families. And then on a societal level, the structural inequalities in education, income, housing, incarceration that are associated with marginalized status are all in interplay throughout this conversation. So for this session, we'll be talking mostly about individual, interpersonal, and community. And I'd like for you all to really reflect and chime in on each of those levels. So this is I think an interesting graph that attempts to tease out some of the ingredients of this complex system of inequities and power dynamics that doesn't really isolate the conversation of inequities and intersectionality to just those who are marginalized and those who are oppressed, because in a hierarchical system, we don't have disparities and inequities without having groups of people who are benefiting and, you know, hyper accessing the systems and abundant and prosperous and privileged. And so you can see that this sort of teases out various marginalized identities and the ways in which people with certain labels, being girls, women, people of color, people with disabilities, visible or invisible, experience marginalization or experience oppression, and the different kinds of structural and interpersonal violence that may be coming from the more privileged groups that benefit from the current status quo in its hierarchical form. To move forward from there, I'd like to have you all think about, as we start to unpack the individual level of thinking about unconscious bias and unintended racism through the lens of intersectionality, just sort of framing question as we talk about the individual level is, how are youth and family members that you serve defining, valuing, devaluing, or channeling their intersecting identities? And at this time, I'd love to be able to have you raise your hand if you'd like to speak to, from your own experience, some of these questions. One being, how do you observe or experience youth that you serve valuing or devaluing their own identities? How do they move between their salient identities as you're able to witness as you guide, support, and serve them? What stereotypes were you socialized into regarding the various identities that are being targeted among the youth? And what opportunities do you have to encourage or facilitate empowerment on an individual basis? When you sit down with one particular youth, how are you able to leverage that opportunity to offer some encouragement or facilitate some empowerment for that person? So if you have thoughts based on these questions, if you have experiences that you'd like to share, now would be a really great time to chime in.
So yes, everyone, feel free to raise your hand and then I will unmute you so you can participate in the conversation. Or you can also add to the chat box if you'd prefer to use that mode. We have some folks in the chat box making sure that I use they, them pronouns in paperwork regarding a trans youth. So being really purposeful with using preferred pronouns.
Mm-hmm. Do people have experiences sort of being able to observe how youth are moving through spaces or experiences with their salient identities?
Could you expand on that, Sharon, a little bit in terms of salient identities?
Yeah, so it's my understanding that many of the youth that you serve are youth of color. I can imagine that among the youth of color that you serve, some have visible or invisible disabilities, or maybe are LGBT. And in some spaces, it's safe to be a young Black boy, but not safe in that space of color to be a queer boy. And so the way in which a person might, you know, mitigate homophobia in a people of color space in order to have some space where they can, you know, like rest their feet and feel like there's some ability to just be. But maybe in more LGBT friendly spaces, they have to kind of code switch and be a different kind of black or brown than they otherwise would be.
That's really helpful. We have someone in the chat box that's also contributing, saying that that's something that they work on is actually listening to what the youth is saying and observing for cues to their behaviors, offer choices, time for them to communicate rather than talking down or blaming. Another participant has said empowerment through talking about bias and events where they were hurt, also empowering them to voice how they feel as opposed to staying silent and continuing the behavior.
That's great. Yeah, and I hope that, and I've offered more questions than we have time to thoroughly unpack, in part because this is such a broad and complex body of aspects of our experience that I wanted for you all to have a lot that you'd be able to kind of digest on your own and moving forward. But those are really thoughtful contributions. Are there any more in the chat at this moment?
No, I think that's
okay.
That's about it for now. And then for folks that maybe we're gonna have some other discussion points further on in the webinar. Just as another point of clarity, if you're wanting to raise your hand, you click on the logo that has participants down at the bottom of your screen, find your name, and next to your name, it'll give you the option of raising your hand or doing, there's some other check boxes and things, but you want to click the one that says raise hand.
And so we'll move forward, but again, if something comes to mind that's really pertinent to the individual level, feel free to chime in at a later point. So thinking about the interpersonal level, a sort of framing question can be, how do discriminatory experiences, microaggressions, and interpersonal trauma influence how youth develop, how they identify and navigate the systems of which you're a part? So to explain microaggressions, microaggressions are these brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities. And so I think oftentimes people kind of get lost on environmental. If you walk into a space, I remember I went to a training, an unconscious bias training that was held at Harvard, and I was in this building, and all of the pictures of the people on the wall were these like old white men. And I was very conscious of the fact that I thought about, like, did any of you own slaves? Did any of your ideas that got you put up on this Harvard wall actually get stolen from some person that you owned that probably looked more like me? You know, so when the environment that you are in offers reflections of either devaluing or omitting or perpetuating derogatory ideas or indignities, whether those are intentional or unintentional, they still communicate and have the impact of delivering hostile, derogatory, and negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, or religious slights and insults to the target person or group. And so some examples, as you can see in this picture, asking somebody who may be ethnically ambiguous, like, what are you? And oftentimes, you know, the person might think, I'm a human, I'm a whole human being, I'm a person. But the person is trying to elicit, like, what is your racial or ethnic background, or where does that accent come from? But the way that it's delivered really can cause someone to feel like you're overlooking the fact that I'm a human, and it can feel harmful. Offering like a compliment that you speak English so well, or Barack Obama, he's so articulate. And it's like, well, of course he is. He went to Ivy League universities. He was like the top at Harvard Law. Like, why wouldn't he be articulate? But what's undergirding that is the assumption and stereotype that Black people speak Ebonics and they don't speak English well. And so to be this like outlying, very articulate Black man wrapped up in a compliment is actually harmful and hurtful and offensive. what do Black people think about that? Or what do gay people think about this new policy that they're trying to pass? Invalidating people's experience. When someone says, I had this racialized experience, I got followed in the store, and the response is, you make everything about race. Not everything is actually about race, which to a person who lives a very racialized experience in the world, where they bear witness to people's racialized responses to their existence. They see it in the media, they see it in the news, and they experience it firsthand. And for you to take that in one comment, to attempt to sort of steal all of that reality away from them is very harmful. And so each one of these comment boxes, each one of these microaggressions, one could perceive as like, that's not that bad though, right? Like, it's not egregious, each individual one. But the reality is that for people of marginalized identities, especially for multiple intersecting marginalized identities, where maybe when you go to your Black church, where you get to really feel like you connect to your faith and you get to connect to some culture, you experience homophobia, so you're not safe. And then maybe when you go to your LGBT spaces and you get to feel like you don't have to hide who you are and who you love, you experience racism or even sexism or even transphobia. So that this cumulative effect and the constant exposure, the daily exposure that people of marginalized identities have to these small, subtle slights, some of them are even subtle to the recipient, where they're like, something doesn't feel right about that, but like, it wasn't a big deal. Do I say something and then, risk making them feel defensive? Or now I'm going to be the angry Black woman or the angry Latina to have to say that was inappropriate. Maybe I don't have the terminology to express how that made me feel or what's wrong with that, but I just know that I feel this way. And so then there becomes a layer of potential self-doubt and even internalization of those comments that can be harmful and compounding over time. So I just want to check in with you all about, using that framework and the definition of microaggressions to just see some of your experiences and perceptions about about microaggressions. So Kelsey's going to run a little poll for us really quick.
I can copy them into the chat box. It looks like we had a little bit of a tech difficulty that popped up there. Mm-hmm. So do you want to read the first poll question? Do you have it in front of you, Sharon, at all? If not, I'll just...
I can pull it up in just a second. Yeah, so the question is, how confident do you feel with your ability to name and identify bias or microaggressions in real time? How confident do you feel with your ability to name or identify microaggressions or bias in real time? Not confident at all, somewhat confident, neither, somewhat confident, or very confident. How confident do you feel?
Great, and I've also posted that into the chat box, so folks can feel free to just, type those in. That's great.
Somewhat, very. So mostly in the realm of confidence so far, in your ability to name or identify bias or microaggressions in real time. Somewhat, lots of somewhat. I see a number of very confident. Well, that's good. So at least you largely got one minimally confident. Okay. So in your ability to recognize that bias is occurring or a microaggression is occurring in real time, that's great. So then let's talk further then. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
somewhat in
the next one in the chat box, you have it there for you as well. And this seems like it's working fairly well. Thanks for everyone for being adaptive.
Yeah, thanks. I saw one. Somewhat in the moment, somewhat often. The discomfort is named after the fact when I have the space to process. I think that's super common. Okay, so in the survey that some of you all participated in, I asked you about your own personal experience of feeling or being marginalized or voiceless within your organization or agency due to any aspect of your own personal identity. Now, keeping in mind that a large majority of the respondents identified as white and as female, it's not uncommon that there isn't a hyper experience of marginalization. But with that audience, 25.6 responded that sometimes and often you all as individuals are feeling marginalized or voiceless. When you expand that to including hardly ever, so meaning at any point in the last year, people felt to some degree marginalized or voiceless, it was almost 50%. And that's as individual professionals, right? When I asked about feeling targeted or attacked based on their identity or group membership, that was a decreased number. So this like more egregious kind of experience or a more severe experience, we saw lesser of you all identifying as such, 14% saying often or sometimes, which is a lot. Like 14% of people who responded to this oftentimes or sometimes feel targeted or even attacked when they go to work trying to serve marginalized populations. And when you extend that to any experience of that, it's 30%. So even just as individual professionals, almost a third of you at some point have felt targeted or attacked based on who you are. So on the one hand, you know, having this conversation is aiming to help support you in your ability to be of service to marginalized communities and to youth. But at the same time, you yourself, you know, as individuals carry identities that are existing within a hierarchy within our society and are susceptible to microaggressions, to bias, and to stereotypes. And then when asked how many times you directly or indirectly witnessed a youth or their families being referred to in derogatory, insensitive, or offensive ways, 54.2% of you responded often or sometimes. And so although you're not as much, you are experiencing this yourselves as targets of these kinds of behaviors, but more than that, you're witnessing it on behalf of the youth that you serve. And so when that extends to even hardly ever, meaning that there's some experience of observation or witnessing of derogatory remarks, it's almost 87% of the people who responded to the survey. When asked about if they'd witnessed bias or microaggression, what was the aspect of their identity that was being targeted, a lot of there was quite an array, quite a variance of the kinds of identities that are susceptible to these remarks. People could check all that applied. And so socioeconomic status, living or housing circumstances, the use of social services, their race, ethnicity, skin color, sexual orientation or gender expression, their neighborhood, their level of trauma or perceived level of trauma or exposure to traumatic experiences, their language, visible, invisible disabilities, immigrant status. So these are the identities that that these young people are carrying, are trying to define for themselves, to find empowerment for themselves, and are experiencing interpersonal and institutional, you know, barriers to empowerment, to representation, to being able to mitigate the societal stereotypes that they are socialized into and that the world perpetuates around who they are. So then with that, I wanted to check in again and ask, let's see, Kelsey, if we were able to get that put into the chat. The next check-in question is, how comfortable do you feel about interrupting bias or microaggression? So it's one thing that you felt largely comfortable with naming it and being able to recognize that it's happening, but how comfortable do you feel actually interrupting it? And when that comes from a colleague or a coworker specifically. So some kind of peer level, how comfortable do you feel with interrupting bias, saying something, stepping in, shutting it down, however that might look for you? So I see comfortable. Okay. Very comfortable, lots of very comfortable, a little bit, somewhat. Okay, so it's a bit more varied than the high level of comfort with naming it. And that's pretty common in my experience, that it's one thing to be able to recognize that it's happening, and then it's another to really be able to challenge it and name it. And so I think it's important for you to pay attention to that for yourselves. How comfortable do you feel interrupting bias and saying something, knowing what to say, or mitigating the the fight, flight, or freeze response that might come to you in that moment? And how is that different if it's a coworker, colleague, or peer versus a family member of the youth that you serve? This is part of the vulnerable populations that you are there to support, versus someone of a higher level within your position or outside of your organization. So just being conscious of that and paying attention to those comfort levels, so that if there's areas where you need to grow or practice, that you can access that. Billie Jean Miller said, it depends on the context of the situation. Comfortable if it does not appear that you are reprimanding a potential supervisor, etc. Yeah, it's very complicated. So in the survey, I asked you all what were some of the roles or titles of the people who made insensitive or disparaging remarks, largely represented by family members and care providers from the youth that you serve, other frontline staff, mid-level administrators, system partners, and so on. And so it's the same with my work that I do with doctors and healthcare providers, that oftentimes it's the patients that are saying the most harmful and inappropriate, insensitive things. And people feel very torn about, how do I hold a space that feels safe for them to be and to speak and to be honest with me, but also emphasize and uphold the values and the ethics that we don't perpetuate bias or stereotypes or harms to other vulnerable individuals and groups. Some of the themes of the microaggressions that you all expressed you have observed included minimizing or devaluing individuals or members of groups, racial and cultural stereotypes, incarceration and substance use stigma, socioeconomic stigma, and LGBT bias and stigma. So things like being put down as not capable based on where I live, not bad for a Mexican, having a perceived lack of competence due to one's age. I was told that my country of origin, a Latino country, was not a country that valued education. I've experienced some microaggressions involving my history of addiction and incarceration, clients being referred to as first of the monthers, or using terms such as lazy and making assumptions based on race and socioeconomic status, misgendering, or coworkers saying they don't agree with some lifestyles. So such an array of, and you can imagine, again, for a youth who is racially, ethnically minority, who maybe English is a second language and who is also queer, or who also, has had substance use experiences, how the intersecting identities that are all marginalized exacerbate and compound and really minimize the potential for being able to access truly safe spaces where they can be themselves. So I'd like to just check in and again, hear from you a bit about what's made it difficult for you to interrupt microaggressions if you've witnessed them. How have you responded when you have been the target of a microaggression? Or how have you responded when you have been called in, or others might say like called out, for perpetuating a microaggression? So not only when you see something and you try to step in to say something, but sometimes we make mistakes or we don't know that terminology has shifted and grown, and we misspeak or we say something that's hurtful or offensive. How have you responded to that? So I'd love to hear from you all about those experiences.
So again, feel free to type into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. We've got some answers coming into the chat box. So some people have really strong reactions to the word junkie. And another person wrote that when I, as a white woman, am with a white family and one of the adults makes a comment about race, that can be very discomforting. When a client is using racial slurs or making comments about certain religions, not wanting to embarrass a person who's speaking in front of a large group is common with inappropriate references to individuals. Not knowing whether something's intentional or unintentional. And then another person is actually commenting about how their boss chastises them for making a big deal about an issue. Another person mentioned working with families or individuals who joke about others they see or have encountered because of religion or race.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And again, I really do encourage you to reflect back on these questions moving forward. And, you know, there's a variety of dimensions that I'm trying to approach your self-reflection, not only you as an individual with complex identities, you as somebody who's supporting very marginalized youth and their families, but also as we sort of pivot into talking about allyship and what we can do, that you are not only trying to grow as a supportive ally to these young people and to their families, but also, you know, mitigating your own biases, embracing that we have biases, and it's our work to identify what they are, what has contributed to them, and unpack them, and then practice being able to mitigate those. And in the process of that, that might include someone letting you know and how you respond to that. So before we move forward into allyship and action, I want to just stop sharing for a moment and we can check in with Emma to take a look at what she's been drawing to
That sounds
reflect.
great. Yeah, we'll turn it over to Emma to share your screen on what you're sharing. And then, yeah, also Sharon, just for a time check for you, we've got about 15 minutes left.
Great, thanks.
All right, are you guys
Whoa! We are seeing it live and in person, so thank you.
Awesome. You're welcome.
Wow, that is so cool.
And this isn't even it completely done.
We still have a little room left. So
Yeah.
it's been great conversation so far. It's been an exciting topic to draw.
Well, thanks so much, Emma, for sharing your screen, and we'll turn it back over to Sharon.
Awesome.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I have never seen that before, and it's so cool. Okay, so speaking on allyship, so this is an image that sort of speaks to LGBTQ allyship in a kind of spectrum. It isn't exactly linear, but the idea that on one side you have the I'm not really an ally, but I'll listen. To I'm starting to get it. And then I really said it, like starting to step up and say things, to the I'm focusing my time on learning and really like taking responsibility for your own growth and education and development, to the I'm talking about LGBT equality, and extending your scope of support beyond just interrupting interpersonal bias, but really thinking about systems of inequity, to the I'm a super ally, let's change some laws and policies. So really getting back to that pyramid image of the different levels of oppression in allyship. And coming from an intersectional feminist perspective from Everyday Feminism magazine, they offer this important things that any ally should know. An ally is not a noun, it's an action. And so another way of saying what it is that you're doing is that I'm currently operating in solidarity with communities of color or marginalized youth or et cetera. But really focusing on, you don't get to just sit comfortably with saying I'm an ally. It has to show up in your actions. It's about listening. It's about hearing and receiving the experiences of people who are subject to forms of oppression and receiving that so that you can grow with it and you can act accordingly to what they're actually experiencing and sharing. It's not a self-proclaimed identity. It's something that has to be attributed to you by the people who experience the benefits of your work. And so you don't want to necessarily walk around touting being an ally. You just should be doing the work. And the people who receive the benefits of that effort will identify you as such. Allies don't get to take breaks. So unfortunately, on Thanksgiving, when homophobic things are being thrown about, or you know, terms about poverty and poor people and what they do or don't do are being tossed around, you don't get to like opt out of speaking up. So if you're going to be speaking up when you're on your 9 to 5, if you're going to be letting that extend into your Facebook community, that the function of allyship and standing up for humans whose lives are devalued and who are marginalized and stigmatized doesn't really get to have breaks and holidays. Allies have to educate themselves, and you shouldn't be expecting that education to come from the people who have to bear the burdens of societal subjugation. And so there's an abundance of information in this, endless sea of information through the internet, through libraries, etc. But the literature and the content is there, and allies have to access it themselves and direct their learning. They don't need the spotlight. Allies focus on those who share in their identity. So if you're a person of color, but you're cisgender and heterosexual, you should be speaking to other heterosexual people of color who express homophobic and transphobic ideas, or practices and suggestions. And so working with people who share in your identities to help them to grow in their understanding and appreciation of the human lives that you are aware of. And when criticized or called out, allies listen, apologize, act accountably, and act differently going forward. And so with that, I want to sort of talk about some potential barriers to allyship. One being imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is this idea that for people who oftentimes are high achieving, they have a hard time internalizing their own accomplishment, and they have this persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. It's this idea that, especially if you are an underrepresented person, you're a woman who pursued STEM careers, or you're a person of color who accessed higher education, or even just had a sustainable profession for the as a first person in your family's lineage, to do that when, especially to be an underrepresented person in a space where there may be stereotypes about people like you, that there's this notion that I don't know what everyone else knows, and people are going to find out that I'm a fake and a fraud, even though you had good grades and you earned it, and that's yours to embrace. Feeling like you're a fake, or feeling like you don't belong, or feeling like you don't know what everyone else knows, instead of the reality that, like, you might know some of what other people know, and you also know your own stuff, and that's an asset to the community and to the work. Stereotype threat is, again, especially for people who represent underrepresented groups or marginalized identities. It's the idea that a person might be in a situation where they're anxious that they might be conforming to or reinforcing a negative stereotype. So things like if someone says something that's offensive or egregious, and you identify as Black or Latina, and you're afraid to speak up because you're going to be labeled as the angry Black person, or if you're the liberal in a conservative space and you say, actually, that's offensive and derogatory, and you are afraid or anxious about the ways in which that might negatively affect you. So these are ways that, especially imposter syndrome and stereotype threat, I see quite often negatively influencing the ways in which people of color can show up as allies in different spaces, but also could extend to other identities. White privilege and racial privilege, and for white allies in spaces where you're serving largely people of color, I find a number of ways in which that shows up as a potential barrier to engaging in allyship, effective allyship. And so what white privilege being, having that white identity not function as a barrier to opportunity, self-determination, or basic human rights. So not to say that you didn't experience poverty or sexism, or other just individual barriers in life, or challenges, or hardships, but that your race wasn't a factor or a function or a contributing variable as to why those barriers exist in your life. And that white identity could be something that could open up doors and opportunities, whether you know that or don't know that. And so racial privilege having to do with having access to resources, power, the luxury of being unaware of race. Oftentimes people who are white aren't necessarily conscious of their salient white identity until later in life. Whereas you can see, the children in that very difficult video to watch are more aware of their racial identity earlier in life. White people can benefit from chosen segregation. They can choose to live in communities that, are mostly populated by white folks. And when a community is largely populated by white folks, the property value goes up, and the property value drives what funds schools. So the schools get to be better because of whiteness in a white supremacist society. And so oftentimes identifying white privilege and one's own whiteness and what that means in a racist, white supremacist society can prompt white fragility. white fragility being a state in which a minimum amount of racial stress, just bringing up racism, talking about race, talking about whiteness. Maybe some of you feel agitated or uncomfortable right now. It becomes intolerable, triggering a variety of different defensive moves that could include anger, fear, guilt, arguing, disagreeing, or becoming silent or separating oneself from the conversation or just leaving the space entirely. And so sometimes white fragility can make it difficult where folks might feel comfortable being of service to people of color and, like, you know, showing that they're not racist by doing this kind of service-oriented work. But when their whiteness and the privilege associated with is named, it can promote these kinds of barriers that actually thwart the potential to grow trust and true inclusion. So here's a kind of image similar to what Emma's working on for us that depicts some aspects of white fragility, but for the sake of time, I'll let you look at that on your own. And I wanted to highlight that if, regardless of what your identities are, if or when you're ever called in because of committing a microaggression, some useful tools that I encourage people to practice are to listen, receive, and validate, and then apologize and change. And so listening to what the person is sharing without having to interrupt, without defending yourself at all, receiving that information, really trying to feel with empathy what that person is, the gift that that person is giving you from sharing that they've been harmed, validating that you're hearing them, that you recognize that you caused harm, validating that you want to change and that you're grateful for the gift of that feedback, apologizing verbally, you know, and then making sure that you take the necessary steps to change. We don't really have time for a proper check-in at this moment, but I do want you to think about and jot down on the worksheet, how do you experience these barriers to allyship and speaking up? How do those show up in your life? How do they feel in your body? What is difficult about having these barriers named, if anything? Were you already kind of clear about the ways that you navigate the space where you work and feel like an imposter sometimes? Or was this new to you? And what does it feel like to name whiteness in this discussion? So lastly, when we think about community and institutions, how they shape youth development, promote inequities, promote harm, or cultivate resilience, largely you all described that your organizations and agencies are engaged in a variety of forms of DEI work. Training and education and policy change are taking place. You feel largely safe and that it's a safe place for all people regardless of your identities. Again, this response, the respondents were largely white, female identified people, and so there might be a very different experience for people who are more marginalized, but there's opportunity for you to be an accomplice. And so thinking about accompliceship versus allyship, an ally is somebody who takes action and who is more likely to challenge institutionalized racism, white supremacy, might interrupt interpersonal biases at social gatherings and other settings. Accomplices really use their positionality within society and within institution to challenge institutionalized racism, to say we need to look at all of our job descriptions and integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into all of these job descriptions so that people have time allocated in their work to work on these issues. Really looking at addressing policies and structures and taking a very anti-racist liberation approach, not only to interpersonal encounters, but really to the structures where they have some agency. An anti-racism lens being really the active process of eliminating racism by changing systems, by changing organizational structures and policies and practices so that power is redistributed equitably. There's this very useful document that outlines the continuum of becoming an anti-racist multicultural organization. So beginning from, it sounds like many of your organizations from how they were reported in the survey are more like a compliance organization, maybe makes official policy pronouncements regarding multicultural diversity, sees itself as a non-racist institution with open doors to people of color. But you can grow into an organization or an institution where the future vision of the institution and the wider community has overcome systemic racism and its forms of oppression by practicing high levels of inclusion, redistribution of power and decision making, having the institution fully reflect full participation and shared power with the diverse racial, cultural, and economic groups of the community that it serves. So that's, I think, an interesting document to try to maybe identify your organization and create some very conscious dialogue about what kind of organization would you like to become and what kind of organization does your community need. So our last sort of opportunity for discussion as we wrap up, thinking about how do the policies and practices increase disadvantage among groups with intersecting marginalized identities within the organizations that you serve? How can your institution work together to increase equity for groups with intersecting marginalized identities? And I'll just like hold the last sort of set of questions and possibilities for our few minutes of discussion. What self-work can you do to increase your own consciousness and allyship? How can you interrupt interpersonal and institutional biases? What barriers do you face in your development as an ally and an accomplice? And how can you influence institutional change and growth? So that's many, many questions, lots of opportunities to reflect, and I'd love to hear from you all with the next couple of minutes that we have.
Thank you, Sharon. Well, and I actually want to propose just a bit of a structural thing. Let's have you stop sharing your screen. We'll have Emma showcase the wonderful visual notes, and we'll have that as a bit of a backdrop before Emma may need to sign off. And we'll leave the remaining time for anyone that wants to stay on the line to have conversation with you, Sharon, if that's okay.
That'd be great.
Lovely.
That works. I am sharing now. All right, is that showing up on everyone's screen?
Yeah.
It is, thank you.
Welcome.
We'll give everyone some time to just take a look at that. And this will be available for download on our PA Care Partnership website. I've put the link into the chat box along with the recording. They will be available as early as Monday of next week, maybe a little bit sooner, but I don't want to promise too soon. I'll type that into the chat box again so folks can see it. But we've been so fortunate to have Emma as a visual artist joining us today to create this really awesome masterpiece of our conversation. So, so thanks so much to Emma. And Emma, if you need to stop sharing your screen, you're welcome to, and we can open it back up for conversation with Sharon.
Oh, thanks, Kelsey. No, I am good to leave this up as long as you need me to leave it up. So.
Okay. Well, then we'll turn it over to you, Sharon, for having some conversations. I can type the questions that you had into the chat box.
Sure, that'd be great. And
that way we kind of have multiple screens going.
And if people have thoughts, ideas, feedback, I'd love to hear from you.
For that, at this stage, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. You might be able to unmute yourself. We're sort of in an open discussion, but probably raise your hand just because we have so many folks on the line. And then you can also add thoughts into the chat box. Okay, so we've got a few folks that have written some things. I'm trying to be an active learner, reading books, listening to podcasts, and signing up to any trainings that help me be better. That was one response that someone gave.
Awesome.
And then also action through an employment setting might vary from family community settings, given the pressures related to income benefits. So they wanted to know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I'm getting from the comment is that there might be a barrier to speaking up or functioning as an ally because if there's resistance, you don't want to lose your job. You don't want to, compromise your livelihood for the sake of being an ally. So one, I think what's been helpful in my experience is identifying the mission and the vision and the values of the institution. And if the institution has identified their values around equity, around what's appropriate and expected of people's behavior and how people should be treated, then when you experience something, one, I think it's valuable to document it, even if it's not like, catching it on recording. But if you write down as these things happen, what time they happen, it becomes better to present to leadership that I'm having these experiences and observations. Is it possible for us to do a survey or an assessment because other people might be having these experiences? And if they are, I think it would be great to align ourselves with these values and these expectations, and not just based on my experience, but if it's possible to just survey, like I did for this webinar, what people's experiences are, to get a better sense of, was this an isolated incident that I was exposed to, or is this more pervasive? And if so, then we as an organization are accountable to our values and to our mission to do something about it. So taking it out, like, one, documenting these things when they happen is helpful, I think, for your own use, but also if you're able to take it outside of yourself and your own individual observation and request or move forward with or promote doing an assessment of the climate and experiences of the broader either employee base or the people that you serve, could help to produce data that then, once the data says this is actually a problem that a third of the people surveyed are experiencing, then you can hold the organization accountable to their values to do something about it. What self-work can you do to increase your own consciousness and allyship?
Those were your questions.
Oh,
yeah.
that sounds familiar.
No, but it's good to repeat them, because for some folks, they might be joining by phone. So if you want to do that,
Yeah.
We also had a request for your contact information. So I'm going to just add that into the chat box.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. So just thinking about how can you increase your own consciousness? How can you increase your own allyship? What barriers do you face in your development as an ally and as an accomplice? And I think rather than feeling like it's some kind of reflection of weakness to name what those barriers or those challenges are, whether they're intrinsic and they're internal or they're external, it actually can be helpful, especially in a community setting like this, because other people probably face those same barriers. And one, by naming them, you, I think, consciously create more capacity to then seek the resources and attract the resources to overcome them. And especially within this setting, you might be able to bounce that off of others and receive some support. Other thoughts or questions, concerns, barriers, challenges?
It looks like we had someone ask, are there books or trainings you would recommend to expand on our understanding and awareness of bias and how to continue to overcome these ideas?
Yeah, I think there's lots of books. My most specialized lens has to do with racial literacy, racial awareness, racial bias, and disparities. And I think one tool that's been very useful in my recent work has been Robin DiAngelo's work on what does it mean to be white and white fragility, especially in working with white folks that serve people of color and vulnerable communities. That's been a very useful tool in helping to grow racial literacy. But even for folks of color, I think just because you experience it and you might feel it and you might be more in tune to discourse doesn't necessarily mean that you have equity vernacular and recognize how to interrupt institutional bias, especially when you're susceptible to it yourself. So I could offer a couple of suggestions and maybe links to some articles that we could share when the webinar gets posted.
Yes, that would be wonderful. We're able to add those to the website, so we can definitely do that, like a little bit of a reading list to go along.
Yeah.
We had someone write in, I really enjoyed diversifying my 4-year-old's bookshelf. I make sure to purchase and borrow books that are not centered around white characters. We also have a book that is a first look at racism and a book about skin color. I love children's books, so it's a great growth. It's great growth for me as well. And I think, yeah, that's so true. There are so many children's books that are for all ages, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, my observation, I also have a 4-year-old, is that especially in the last 6 to 8 years, there has been an increase in books for having a Black child, around Black characters and characters of different colors. And unfortunately, so many of them have to do with loving myself, or I love my hair is big and that's okay and I love it. And I appreciate that and we need that. However, we also need to normalize that Black and brown children also like need to learn shapes and like science and about bugs and the world. And so hopefully, you know, we'll continue to expand the publication of books that just normalize that characters doing all of the things that children's books present to our children are also done by Black and brown people and characters. So in my mind, I write children's books that do that, but hopefully we'll continue to see a growth in those opportunities. I need to
dedicate. That's a really great way to conceptualize how to be active, right? Think about what you would tell a child to do and maybe start there. Think about how you would convey it in a children's book is a great practice for envisioning a better world and actions that we all can do and are achievable. There's a great hashtag that's used now a lot called hashtag diverse books. So that's another thing too for folks, whether you're working in mental and behavioral health care, you're looking at doing building audits and trying to make sure you have magazines and books in your lobbies that are and offices that are representative of the communities you serve. You might want to check out that hashtag campaign to find some new books that have been published recently.
Yeah. You know, and I'd also say there's so much, many people are commenting about like needing to grow in your own education. And I will also offer that as you continue to educate yourself, be cautious about hyper informing yourself about the disparity and the disadvantage aspect of marginalized groups. Because as much as people of color and people of marginalized identities have experienced oppression and structural and interpersonal violence, we've also always resisted. We've also always built for ourselves. We've also always enacted agency against those sources of oppression. And so as much as it's important to read up on like the data about disparities and the sources and the origins of systems of oppression, also be looking for what have communities done to act in resistance against those forms of oppression. Like the Black Panther Party is a prime example where we've been socialized largely to see them as like gun-toting, maybe militant in like a kind of derogatory way, but not thinking about that they created over 65 community empowerment programs. The reason why the federal government invested money in sickle cell anemia research was because of the Black Panther Party. The reason that, you know, low-income children have free breakfast through their public schools was because that was co-opted from the Black Panther Party creating that initiative. And so keep in mind that we should be also learning about how communities have self-determined and resisted against oppression so that we can learn from that ourselves, and that can be messaging that you also offer in your moments of empowerment and connection with these youth.
Well, and Sharon, as we close out for the day, we have one participant who's been wanting to contribute to the conversation. So Maria, I see your hand. I'm going to lower your hand and unmute you if you want to speak. 1 second. Here we go. Unmute. Let's see. Oh, it might be asking you. Okay.
Hi, Sharon. How are you?
Hi, well,
there we go. We can hear you.
Good. I just, in regards to one of your questions, what have been one of the barriers? So I myself, I began a new job this past year in a school. My school is in a predominantly white area. I'm Latina myself. And so my biggest barrier was one, being new to the school, but not only that, but being new and a Latina, predominantly white, and working with the children who are of color. And earlier in your conversation, when you had one of your first breakout conversations, one of the questions was, how have we observed our youth? How have we observed them coming in and out, I guess? And one of the things that I've observed is, especially working with the Black young men that I worked with and the Latino boys that I worked with, is, you know, around me feeling that comfort, knowing that I'm not the Latina, they were in their comfort zone.
Yeah.
They behaved in a natural way. And the minute they went out in the hallways, It was about buttoning up my shirt and trying to walk the way they want me to walk or the way they want me to talk. And so that is my biggest barrier. You don't understand how, what an impact this training has for me, because this is something from the month that I was in this school. I just took notes and I realized, oh my gosh, we need help here. There's a problem here. So I promise that I'm going to take this training and do much with it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And, you know, I would say being new is an asset. You can reframe that. Being new doesn't mean there's a lot that you don't know. It means that you have a new perspective that maybe people who've been there for a long time are not as able to see some of the things that you're able to see because you came with fresh eyes. The fact that you're a Latina is not a barrier because most other people are white. It's an added asset that allows you to be in and of yourself for your own existence, a safe space to the young people who can relate to that. And they're able to show you, what it is that they need that they haven't been able to share with the folks who are already there and who were white. And so I would, in addition to taking this training and sharing it with others, consider, reframing what you have experienced or perceived as barriers. How can you find the asset there? And you present not only the insight that you offer, but the assets that you're able to package that information with, because those are not just deficits and they're not just barriers or challenges. Those are strengths also.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone and give you, Sharon, an opportunity if you have any final thoughts before we turn it over. Emma, as well, if you can stop sharing your screen, we're just going to transfer it over to our farewell slides for our team.
Awesome. Yeah, I just would thank you all for your time, your attention, your participation, and really thank you so much for the extraordinary work that you're doing on behalf of communities that are marginalized, that are recovering, that are constantly trying to reconceive our identities and present to the world who we truly are. So I thank you, and I deeply appreciate what you do. I encourage you to take good care of yourselves as vectors and vessels of change and growth and safe spaces, especially in these chaotic times that we're in. So please prioritize yourself in the journey of your work. And feel free to contact me if you have other questions, or if you are unsettled on any aspect or any reflection opportunity that I presented. I would love to continue to grow in collaboration and dialogue with you if you would like. So thank you all.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon, for everything that you've shared with us today. For folks, you should now be seeing on your screen the link to where the webinars are posted for not only our 2020 series, but past years as well. And Sharon's webinar will be made available early next week, along with Emma's visual that you saw today of the visual notes of our conversation. Sharon, also, if you feel like you want to type into the chat box any additional contact information, I think I posted your website. If you have any, I wasn't able to put the LinkedIn or Facebook links in there, but I'm sure folks can find that from your website. So as we end all of our webinars for the Cultural Linguistic Competency series, we leave you with cultural competence and linguistic competence, our life's journey, not a destination, safe travels. And again, this is my contact information. If for any reason you are unable to download the slides or the PowerPoint, or you're not able to get them next week, or you want to talk about new partnerships and new opportunities for building our CLC programming across the state of Pennsylvania, please feel free to reach out to me. So again, thank you so much to our keynote speaker, Sharon Washington, and to our visual artist, Emma from Ink Factory, for all of the wonderful work that you did today. And thank you to all of you for joining in and building your cultural and linguistic competency today.